Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I am Sonali Randhawa, Research Associate, Health Systems Governance at Health Systems Transformation Platform. HSTP works in the areas of health policy, service delivery, financing, and health policy and systems research. As a step towards generating a body of work for strengthening regulation in the health sector, we conducted a study titled Regulation of Healthcare Delivery in India, a Landscape Study. We organized this webinar regarding the study which we have undertaken, what we learned, and also to initiate a discussion on how we can collaborate and build a partnership to strengthen health regulations in the country. We are glad to have with us Professor Dr. Rama V. Baru and Professor Dr. Deepika Jain. We welcome any questions, clarifications that you may have. In the interest of the time, I request you to please type your questions or comments in the Q&A box in your control panel, and we will have time for the discussion at the end. Now, without further ado, I welcome our CEO, Mr. Rajeev Sadanandan, former Additional Chief Secretary of the Health and Family Welfare Department, Government of Kerala. He has worked in the areas of health system, policy, and health economics, among others. He was the CEO of the National RSBY program, held tenures in the central and state government in the various capacities. So over to you, please.
Thank you, Sonali. Once again, let me also welcome all the participants who have joined us today. As Sonali mentioned, the organization Health Systems Transformation Platform, we work in the area of health systems and policy research. We structure our work around the different building blocks that constitute health systems, including financing, organization of service delivery, etc. One of the building blocks that is foundational in the functioning of health system, which we believe has not received the attention it deserves, is regulation. That is why HSTP chose regulation as one of the building blocks to focus our initial work on. We've been fortunate to have the support of Sri Sunil Nandaraj, whose commitment and experience in the area of health regulation is well known. He was joined by Pallavi and Sonali from the HSTP. Together, they set out to prepare a document that covers the entire spectrum of central health laws in the country. The landscape document being launched today is designed to touch the basics of all the important central laws that apply to health. It's also accompanied by a repository of central laws which have been compiled by the team and is available on our website. Our hope was that both the resources, that is landscape document and the repository of central laws, will be useful for the students and researchers and will also stimulate further work in this area. But these base documents have to be built on to grow into something substantial. What we hope is that it will be possible for us to collaborate with individual institutions that have done substantial work in this area. We would like to form a collaborative of like-minded people who recognize the place of regulation and improving health systems. As part of our work, we hope that we can demonstrate the connection between research, evidence, policy, regulation, and implement, and how all these working together produce an integrated whole, which is more than the sum of the parts. I'd also like to thank Professor Rama Baru for agreeing to deliver the keynote address and Dr. Deepika Jain for agreeing to critique the document for the listeners. Once again, welcome and thank you for joining the webinar, and hope that we'll be able to work with many of you as we take this work forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rajeev sir, for the introduction. I now invite our keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Rama V. Baru. She's a professor at the Center of Social Medicine and Community Health, School of Social Sciences in Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She has authored many books and papers, including Private Healthcare in India, Social Characteristics and Trends, Medical Insurance Schemes for the Poor Who Benefits. Professor Rama specializes in and has written extensively on health policy, commercialization of medical care, and health inequalities. I now welcome Professor Rama. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very, very much. Good afternoon. I wish to thank Rajeev Sadanandan and his colleagues at the Health Systems Transformation Platform for supporting a very important area of health regulation, which has not got the serious attention that it requires. Sunil Nandaraj is one of the few researchers who has worked on various aspects of regulation and also advocated for its implementation in his various capacities in the country office of the WHO, Ministry of Health, and as an active member of civil society movements. I have read this comprehensive report authored by Sunil, Pallavi, and Sonali, which we shall hear more about in their presentation. An important contribution of this report, which I have argued for several years, is the need for a systems approach to regulating health services, medical, nursing, and paramedical education, insurance, drugs, technology, and research. The challenges for regulating a health system where the private sector dominates in each of these subsystems is clearly a major area of work. In addition, given the federal nature of governance, the center-state relationship is an important part of the whole area of translation of regulations that often tend to be centrally directed. Often regulation is seen merely as a technical and an administrative instrument. However, the scope, depth, and comprehensiveness of regulations and regulatory institutions are defined and driven by power and politics. One could argue that the fragmented landscape in regulations has serious consequences for ethical practice, cost, quality, and equity. An important reason for this fragmentation is, in my view, the retrogressive role played by professional associations and their respective councils. This space for self-regulation is very important for leading, strengthening regulatory structures and adherence to rules and authority. The resistance to regulation has come largely from professional bodies by resorting to courts or just bypassing or really resulting in non-compliance. The councils, whether it is the medical council or the nursing council, who have been deeply compromised. As a result, there is little interest or cooperation with the government and civil society efforts for regulation. My few years of experience as a member of the ethics committee of the erstwhile Medical Council of India gave me an idea how well-formulated rules and guidelines had been rendered ineffective by professionals represented in the councils. I also realized that the real power lay with the state councils that were often controlled by a mafia of corrupt professionals. And this was something that a lot of doctors who really feel the need for regulation feel that their interests are not represented by either the councils or by their own professional associations. The private sector across levels of care has contested and resisted regulation. Their large presence in provisioning, education, drugs, and technology poses a challenge to regulation. Given the diversity, hierarchy, that gives rise to differentiation in power across the private sector, the distribution and representation of power within the private sector can be studied based by the levels of interest. You can actually classify this in terms of dominant, challenging, and repressed interests. The dominant being largely represented by corporate interests through the drug technology as well as the hospital industry. The challenging are your secondary level care, your nursing homes, your small domestic producers, and your repressed is really your informal providers and also Indian systems of medicine. An important area flagged by today's report is medical and paramedical education and the need for regulatory bodies for both the public and private sectors. Regulation for quality and cost are critical. A recent analysis done by me and Divate for the Indian Higher Education Report for medical, nursing, and allied health disciplines, including other systems of medicine, shows a very large presence of the private sector in all these three with tremendous interregional variations. So the landscape for regulatory framing is indeed a huge challenge for the present times. It is also the case that whenever regulatory authorities are set up, there is very little systemic speak between the various regulatory authorities. For example, the Insurance Authority and the nascent Clinical Establishments Act implementation, there is a clear misfit or a lack of speak between the various regulatory authorities. There have been systems for accreditation, and I remember in the 90s, there was a great deal of discussion for the need for accreditation, not just for provisioning, but also for medical education. But it seemed as if something would happen, especially with global accreditation coming into the play. But what we find is even that has not really yielded the kind of results we expected. To me, regulation and reform are closely linked. So when we are looking at the translation of regulation, we are also in the process trying to reform the health services to really speak to the ideas of quality, controlling costs, as well as equity. To me, the other important aspect of this report is to also look at some of the public health acts that they have covered. And in the recent pandemic, the many fault lines that we see in terms of lack of regulation came to the fore. And I think the point that this report actually makes is the inadequacy of some of these legal provisions, and also a certain colonial historical past, which seems to overshadow how we look at many of these situations. So if you even look at the Epidemics Act and then see it in relation to the Disaster Management Act, you find that they come from two very different historical moments, and there is very little coordination or speak between the two. So I think what we are really looking at is, if we take COVID as the window to look at what is the state of regulation, and as Rajiv said, it's very, very important, I think, for some like-minded people to come together to provide some form of coherence between the different legal as well as regulatory authority kind of provisions, and to really be able to rationalize it across the board. Now, that's clearly a big task, and that's why I brought power and politics into the equation. So where are the resistances is something that we have to look at. So what about the professional bodies? Can they be involved? Are there elements within them that can be involved? Can we use various competing interests within these institutional forms to really forge ahead with some form of a kind of an architecture that needs to be placed? The other very important thing, I think, which we need to look at is what is the ecosystem? What is the kind of analysis that's required to build this ecosystem? And who are the actors who could be potential partners? I think in the area of regulation, my view is that we cannot go back to the old formula of the government, civil society, and leave the private sector out. I don't think we're going to get very far. So I think we need to really sort of build an ecosystem where we have representation of people from these various quarters, including those who feel that their respective associations or even their respective councils are redundant in providing ethical care, and can we build that kind of a movement towards that being realized. And it is not just a civil society movement. It has to be a very conscious building of an ecosystem with an architectural framework that can actually bring the speak of different needs of regulation together. And I do believe that the institution, the health systems transformation platform, would be an ideal body to be able to broker such a process, to be able to actually undertake some analysis, to identify partners and actors in both the center and the state, and I would place greater emphasis on the state, and to have a realistic pathway of what is the readiness of different states for even a movement towards a regulation. So, with these few words, and I want to say thank you once more, and I look forward to Deepika's comments on the report, and of course, hearing the presentation of the report itself. Thank you, Rajiv. Thank you to all your colleagues, and it's great to see old friends and also to meet new ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Rama, for your stimulating insights on the health regulations. And I think we also kind of agree the fragmented landscape of health regulation have had effects on the service delivery, on the patients, on the providers also. And there's a lack of speak between the various regulatory authorities. So I think with this background, that Professor Rama has given us, I would now invite Mr. Sunil Nandaraj, advisor to HSTP, leading the work on health systems governance. He has actively been working with the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, various state governments such as Kerala, Maharashtra, New Delhi, and was earlier working in WHO. He played a key role in drafting the Clinical Establishments Act 2010. Sunil, if you could talk us why we felt the need to undertake such a study and what are the bottlenecks when it comes to governance and regulation in the health sector in our country. What do you say?
Thanks, Sonali. Thanks, Professor Baru and Professor Deepika. Thanks for joining. Ladies and gentlemen, I would start with something like each one of us has lost someone dear or know of someone who has lost a dear one in the present pandemic. Many of the deaths, we could have avoided it. It has been one of the biggest disasters in the post-World War II. Looking at our own healthcare systems, we have been unable to meet or cope with the requirements and needs of the people in this present pandemic. It is not our health systems have failed, not just because during the pandemic, but our health systems have really been found to be wanting in terms of accessibility to a large number of population, quality, affordability, among other parameters. Before someone says that, hey, we have made some progress, I beg to differ. The only progress we have made is in infant mortality rates and maternal mortality rates coming down. Our cost of healthcare has gone up tremendously. Utilization of public health services has come down. And our public healthcare system is somewhere found wanting. And we have a huge unregulated private health sector that has been functioning without any accountability or transparency. Why are we in this present condition? Don't we have human resources? Don't we have the infrastructure or technology? I mean, medical colleges, around 400 medical colleges, allopathy, and then the ISM, and, don't we have medicines or pharmaceuticals? We produce 50,000 branded drugs in our country. Vaccines, every 5th child or 7th child in the world gets vaccine produced in India. I somewhere feel always my generation has failed the country in 3 major areas: health, education, nutrition, law and order, providing justice. There are many more areas where we have failed. What is missing is how do we put in place rules on how we function as a society or a country? How do we govern ourselves? What restrictions or regulations are in place? There is not much which Rajiv and Rama have said. Focus on regulations and governance. I think regulations are form part of the governance. Who is responsible? I think we need to go into the nature of state. Whose interest it serves? The non-regulation and the decline of the rule of the law in our country brings out the true nature of the state in India. I'm not getting into the political economy of the state. but governance and regulations needs to be examined in that context. I think we need to look at the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, and finally the people. How do we function in terms of accountability and transparency? Are our functionaries who are elected or appointed accountable? I mean, a simple question I'd like to ask. Is the health secretary of a state or the union government accountable? No. Why do we hold the ASHA who are responsible for targets and all that? Can we make the principal secretary health of every state accountable and say that if you don't achieve this, I mean, accountability starts from there. For me, this is the major issues. Accountability has to be right from Nirman Bhavan up to the DHO level. I'm also questioning the entire accountability of civil society and NGOs. I mean, international organizations, of course, both multilateral and bilateral, and most of our institutions have failed in our country. I'm really sorry to say this, but somewhere there is no system. Transparency. In our country, no one wants to be transparent. Simple thing, private hospitals do not want to share the data or information they have. Laboratories do not share. There is no transparency. In our country, private health sector is not regulated, not accountable, and not transparent. We did not have a regulation for the last 70 years. And finally, after 70 years, we had something called the Clinical Establishment Act. Till then, beauty parlors, beer bars, and liquor shops were regulated, but not hospitals or laboratories. We have challenges in implementation, not because we do not have the resources or brains, but we have this chalta attitude that we do not give importance to use the issues of treating our citizens as human beings. I really feel strongly about this. Simple things like fees and charges being regulated. I go to a hotel, I ask for a menu, I get the rates. But when I go to a hospital, I do not. When I enter an hospital, they don't ask me what diseases or illnesses you have. They ask me what grade of room you want to get in. And then the treatment is decided by the grade of room I decide. I mean, we have made gains, but they are very slow. There is major opposition, which Rama brought out, to any kind of regulation by vested interest. They scuttle it by using systems like judiciary. Maharashtra and Delhi have one of the oldest acts, but they have failed to regulate. Few days back, finally, Delhi government has started moving, and I was involved in trying to put together. But, it's got an act of 1953 and nothing happens. It's taking so many decades, not years, to get one thing. So in Delhi, laboratories are not regulated. Barber shops are regulated. Just like to highlight that, a few friends of mine are trying to come out with a pamphlet on the rights to the pharmacies, rights at the pharmacy. We found that Ayurvedic shops selling Ayurvedic medicine are not regulated, not licensed. It's so sad. Changes in India in health regulation have been many. Okay, there have been. But it has been more because of certain individuals who have pursued it and made it their mission to make certain issues accountable, providers accountable, sir. Like, for example, the PCPNDT, I will always tell my friend Dr. Sabu George, or Right to Information by Aruna Rai or Nikhil Dey or Shailesh Gandhi. There have been groups who have been pushing for the tobacco legislation, and they've done a wonderful job. I mean, mental health also falls in the same thing. And not to leave out bureaucrats like Vineet Chaudhary, Goel, LC Goel, sir, and of course, Rajiv in Kerala, Amarjit in Bihar, who took it upon themselves to push for certain legislation, to push for regulations. And there are far and few between people like that. What are the options? How do we take it forward? It's not just legislations, as Rama said very clearly. There are other methods we need to explore and follow. I think first is collaboration between organizations and individuals to bring in various skills, information, and expertise. I don't think any one organization or individual has all the capacities. Information, I'm very strong proponent of information and data in public domain. Put the information in the public domain. Let people and groups and organizations take up and make the authorities, regulators, providers accountable. We need to facilitate some good, strong consumer organization. We need to provide for redressal mechanism, provide platforms and spaces where people can make complaints, can ask for redressal. I think another aspect is using technology to regulate. Look at the way railways, how they have used technology. The fantastic simple thing like PAN card. I cannot do any transaction in my country without the PAN card. Earlier, I would do all kinds of things. Look at how the ATM has changed our lives. Banking, using technology, mobiles, In our country, we have apps for ordering food, taxis, counting cows also, but sadly, not for health facilities and services. I do not know. I can order a manchow chicken and whatnot, but I cannot know where my blood banks are in my own city, Developing capacities and good health level technical knowledge. That is another area that we need to look at. Self-regulation, sorry, this is my personal opinion, does not work in India so much. We have tried, we have failed. MCI is one of the classic cases. So I am really looking at that. Last but not the least, this is slightly controversial. I would say give space and encourage younger health professionals, lawyers, management, software technology professionals, older people. I don't want to give the figure or age figure. Older people should take a back seat. Do mentoring, give encouragement, guidance, avoid being on committees, technical decision-making bodies. Give space to youngsters. How long are we guys going to sit on this high-flying bodies and, come off it? Last, I'm just going to end, Pallavi, I know she's getting... when Rajiv asked me to join HSTP, I said regulation area, and thankfully he agreed. In the coming period, our focus in HSTP is on building capacity, engaging with various partners, organizations, law schools, central and state governments and regulatory bodies, undertaking studies and documentation, pushing for regulation and better government. This document is just a start. It's not an end. We are hoping it will lead to many more issues, which I won't say make a difference in the health sector, at least make a dent in the health sector. Thank you. I now ask my colleague Pallavi Gupta to share the findings of the study. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sunil. And thank you to you all for joining us here today. Just want to confirm, is my screen visible to everybody?
Yes, Pallavi.
Yes, it is.
Oh,
yes, it is, Pallavi.
Thank you. Thank you. So thanks, Sunil, and thank you to you all. So as Sunil mentioned, I will share with you some of the highlights of the work that we have done in the past year. And some of the issues have already been addressed, so I will skip those slides in the interest of time. Sunil also spoke about why we need to do the study. As Professor Rama also said, that a landscape of regulations, there isn't much literature available on regulation of health system. Individual laws have been looked at and worked upon, but a comprehensive landscape of the regulations. So that is what we set out to do here. Our objective was to review and describe the landscape of regulations specifically related to healthcare delivery in India. And we did this at the central government level. We looked at the legal provisions and the institutional mechanisms, as well as the gaps and challenges in the regulatory system. And we defined, for the purpose of our study, we defined healthcare delivery as the provision of services through an interface between providers and patients or consumers to diagnose conditions, diseases, events that require medical intervention. In other words, it is understood to be as an output of the inputs into the health system, the inputs being human resource, health infrastructure, such as health facilities or supportive services, pharmaceuticals, medical devices. I'm sorry. Yeah. So the methodology that we adopted, we looked at the resources available. That is, we reviewed the acts, notifications, orders issued mainly by the Government of India, judicial orders passed by the courts, documents published by statutory bodies, proceedings of government meetings and parliamentary committees that are there in the public domain, papers published in books and peer-reviewed journals, websites of government ministries and departments, and the information available in the media. And in the process, like Rajiv mentioned, we also put together a compilation of health legislations that have been promulgated by the Union government. These have been organized into 28 categories. And I must also mention that this was a continuation of previous work undertaken by our team member, Mr. Sunil Nandraj, along with his then colleague, Anaga. So we took that work forward and put this compilation together. A link to this repository is being shared with you in the chat box. You may please access it on the HSTP website for further reference. So for the purpose of the study, we developed a framework of analysis to review the regulatory instruments with respect to the purpose of regulation and the entities to be regulated. And this framework is based upon frameworks suggested by other researchers in the past for low and middle income countries. So what are the purposes that we were looking at when we sought out to review the regulatory instruments? So one of them is the entry of service providers, entry of health facilities. What is the requirement for registration, for renewal? In terms of quality, we will look at some of the parameters, standards of care, standard treatment guidelines, rational care, affordable safety measures. Quantity of services is another aspect that we looked at in terms of availability as per geographic area or population or need for services. Pricing and cost containment, as again, Professor Rama and Sunil both mentioned about the cost of care. So do we have regulations for controlling the fees, pricing of healthcare services, preventing escalation of costs? Then patient safety was another aspect, and protecting patients and consumers. So not using inappropriate technologies or products or services, maintaining confidentiality. And information provision, as Sunil mentioned, that information provision to people, to patients, to consumers, as well as information sharing with the government for public health measures, and the mechanisms for grievance redressal. Amongst the entities, when we come to healthcare service delivery, we looked at different cadres of practitioners, health facilities that provide services, supportive services, some of the professional actions for which we have specific laws in the country, mental health, HIV, and of course the epidemics and pandemics in the current context. Before I get into the findings of the study, I would like to share what we set out and what are the limitations. So we looked at only the union government legislations. We haven't looked at so much the state level legislations. And for the purpose of the study, we have restricted to delivery of healthcare services. The other aspects of healthcare, production and research related to pharmaceuticals, vaccines, medical devices, they are covered to a limited extent as relevant to the delivery of healthcare. And we did not analyze at this stage the regulations for their impact. Maybe that is the work that can be taken in future. At this point of time, we did not do that. Briefly talking about practitioners to start with. So we looked at what are the key legislation that govern the practitioners. Of course, there are others also which we have looked at, and we talk about that in the report, like the Drugs and Cosmetics Act and Clinical Establishments Act. The key legislation for each practitioner group that we have looked at, some of these are listed here. The newest on this category is the National Commission for Allied and Healthcare Professions Act that came out just this year. And this is the first such act at the central level, which is giving the required attention to the allied professions. With respect to some of the older acts, like Professor Baru mentioned, that some of these acts were repealed, the Indian Medical Council Act and those for the Indian systems of medicine. And we have newer acts coming in the last couple of years, the National Medical Commission Act 2019, the National Commission for Indian Systems of Medicine Act 2020. And in nursing and dentists, bills have been introduced so far, but they have not been enacted into act as yet. So the reason for some of the acts being repealed and new ones coming up, again, as has been mentioned, mainly the reason was that the statutory councils have been unable to regulate and set out their mandated responsibilities. There was inherent conflict of interest. This was also observed by parliamentary committee reports from time to time. Another issue that we found is there is lack of clarity and consensus between the central and state regulatory bodies as to about their roles and jurisdiction. So whether it is the Indian Nursing Council and the State Nursing Council or the Dental Council of India or the state councils. So there is this overlap in their jurisdiction. Another example that we saw was that to increase the scope of nursing, 2 new nurse practitioner courses have been introduced in midwifery and critical care. But corresponding changes to the Indian Nursing Council Act 1947 have not been effected to include these courses as recognized qualifications, which limits their use, therefore. And amongst the new acts, while there is more that can be said about them, and whether they are for good or bad is not a matter for discussion for this particular moment. But one thing that we would like to highlight is that they provide for an annual joint sitting of the 3 commissions, and therefore greater engagement between the various systems of medicine and promotion of medical pluralism, something which has been a contentious issue over the last several years. Talking of health facilities, as Sunil mentioned, until the Clinical Establishments Act came up, in many states, the facilities did not require to be registered or to obtain license to start providing health services. Many of the state laws were outdated, inadequate. The rules had not been formulated. In some, still they have not been formulated, and hence there were no minimum standards. So as of now, as of March 2021, Clinical Establishments Act is applicable in 11 states and 6 union territories. It prescribes minimum standards for infrastructure, human resources, medical equipment, etc. However, it does not prescribe process and outcome standards. That is a lacuna that we still have. And again, as was mentioned earlier, there are no legislative mechanisms for fixing the cost of services, conducting clinical and social audits, or ensuring patient rights. Now, staying with the delivery of services in terms of outreach services, the mobile medical units, so Clinical Establishments Act 2010 covers 3 different types of mobile medical units providing services, but the minimum standards are yet to be notified for these. Medical camps, I'm sure many of us are familiar. They are regulated to a limited extent by government guidelines and court orders, but there are no specific laws. And there have been concerns about the quality of services in medical camps, leading to infections as well as deaths in case of sterilization particularly. Telemedicine is one interesting sector which is coming up, and the guidelines were introduced in 2020 through the Indian Medical Council Regulations 2020. And very interestingly, till then, it was not clear whether providing services online is legal. In 2019, for example, the Karnataka Medical Council gave a directive to its members not to provide online services. Otherwise, they would face penal action, which could include even cancellation of their license. So that ambiguity was there until then. That is now cleared by these guidelines, which prescribe who can and how can the services be provided online. We also looked at home-based care, which is again one sector which is now gaining a lot of importance, especially in the times of COVID. And we realized that it is largely outside the purview of regulation. And because of limited regulation, there are already concerns being raised about quality of services provided through home-based care. And this is one area that HSTP has identified for ourselves that we would like to take on further. We'll be doing some initial exploratory work in this area to understand it better, because as of now, very little is known about how this mode of delivery is working. For supportive services, if we talk of laboratories and diagnostics, the Clinical Establishments Act is what provides regulation to laboratories and diagnostics. And obviously only the state's duties where it is applicable, does it apply to laboratories and diagnostics as well. Many states do not include laboratories within their ambit, the state laws. And so no minimum standards need to be followed there. As a result, there are issues of non-standardization of service quality and supplier-induced demands in this area. So we have the NABL, the National Accreditation Board for Testing and Calibration Laboratories, which is a voluntary accreditation system. And of about 100,000 laboratories that we have in India, around 4,000 are accredited by NABL. Again, there are several issues that one can get into with respect to NABL accreditation as well. But moving ahead for now, in supportive services, we also put ambulances under supportive services for delivery of healthcare. They are registered as transport vehicles under the Motor Vehicle Act, Central Motor Vehicle Rules of 89 and the National Ambulance Code. They lay down the structural elements, functional elements, minimum standards required for drugs and equipment. And the State Transport Department can fix cost for ambulance services per kilometer. But as all of us saw that this really did not work during the pandemic, where the costs of ambulance services really escalated too much. One recent development is through the National Commission for Allied and Healthcare Professions Act, where 2 cadres of professionals are mentioned who can potentially be providing services in the ambulances as paramedics. the emergency medical technologist, and the advanced care paramedic. And so it would be interesting to see how this goes forward. And it could really bring some regulation into the ambulance and the personnel who attend to people in need of care under emergency. Yeah, in terms of pharmacies, the pharmacies are regulated by the Drugs and Cosmetics rules of 1945. The issue that we came across in this, one of the issues is the multiplicity of regulators, both by the drug inspector under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act and the pharmacy inspector under the Pharmacy Act. So there is overlap between the two. And the role of e-pharmacies of concerning, say, online sale of drugs. There is no specific regulation as such for online sale of pharmacy of the drugs. The draft rules were shared in 2018, but they have not been enacted yet. So online pharmacy remains, again, unregulated. With respect to blood banks, which are referred to as blood centers, since 2020, the change was introduced. So the Drugs and Cosmetics Act 1940 regulates the collection, storage, and processing distribution of blood banks. In this, the dual licensing system, obtaining license from state and central authorities, that has made the process tedious and confusing for blood banks to operate. And also there is overlap in the role of the National AIDS Control Organization and the National Blood Transfusion Council, as both of them are involved in policy formulation for operation of blood banks. Some of the specific laws that we have for certain services, we looked at the MTP Act of 1971 that legalized abortion in certain conditions. However, despite the latest amendments of 2021, access to abortion still remains conditional. And the decision-making power is not really with the person concerned, but outside the person. And then there is conflict with laws such as the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act when it comes to access of adolescent girls to abortion services. With respect to providers, concerns such as possibility of being prosecuted under the Indian Penal Code, laws, conflict and conflation with the PCPNDT and the POCSO Act. Because of that, providers are cautious in providing MTP services. With respect to transplantation of human organs, the 1994 Act was amended in 2011 to add tissues to the Act, and it has been adopted in 16 states and all the union territories. However, this is one area that we feel has received not enough attention, and there is scope to work more in this area. There is lack of data at this national and state level about requirement of people, of patients available to donate, of patients in the waiting list. And while there have been efforts made to amendment to bridge this data gap and to bring in better coordination between available resources and for transporting and storage and adequate use, this is one area which has not really got the attention and not enough work has been done. And it could be explored whether we would like to work in this area. Coming to illness and diseases, Mental Health Care Act, which repealed the Mental Health Act of the 1987. This is a progressive and patient-centric act from our reading of the act, and it grants the right to mental health care. Now, this is again interesting because we don't have a right to health or a right to health care, but this act grants the right to mental health care. And it also introduces a concept of advanced directive, wherein the patient concerned has the power to give their preference for treatment. Only registered establishments can provide mental health services. It prohibits certain coercive procedures and decriminalizes suicide attempt by people with mental health conditions. The HIV Prevention and Control Act 2017, which was enacted in 2018, it prohibits discrimination, denial, or unfair treatment and protects the rights of the persons concerned. And the providers have to provide services without discrimination and not disclose the HIV status of patients. What it also does is it has made antiretroviral therapy a legal right of the affected persons. Though again, if you see, there are only about 528 ART centers nationally for more than 2 million people, and therefore access continues to remain a challenge. Now, lastly, the epidemics, pandemics, with the context of COVID-19 where we are. I'm not spending a whole lot of time on this. A lot has been written. All of us are aware of the deficiencies of these two acts and how they were not able to regulate the care delivery during the pandemic. And there have been several attempts made in the past over the years to bring in new legislation. The latest was in 2017, the Public Health Bill of 2017. But we have not seen that fructifying so far. And this is one area that we would like to work on with other interested groups, organizations, on drafting a new legislation and taking this process forward. In the end, just to conclude, to summarize some of the main highlights of our findings and what we see as issues of concern. So there is an absence of legislation on fees or cost of care, whether it is the fees of the providers or services at health facilities or laboratories or ambulances, for all of them. There is no legislation to regulate the quantity and distribution of services, so by geography or by population. So as a result, we have the skewed distribution in urban and rural areas, as well as regional disparities. So some states and regions have more educational institutions and more providers, while others have lesser institutions and lesser providers. So while we have a lot of laws, at the same time, there are still areas on which we do not have adequate laws. And another issue that came across in different laws, and that I did share in the beginning as well, is the conflict and overlap between different laws and agencies, which makes not only the implementation, but there is the interpretation of different laws is very different, and then that creates confusion for people accessing services. So hence, from the work that we have done, our understanding is that we've done a very broad-based study of the legislation that exists. There is need to go in depth into some of the specific legislations for which it has not been done, to work more on areas that are not regulated so far. And of course, strengthening implementation remains. And involvement of the patient and user community, I think, is another important thing that we need to focus on as we move ahead. So I'll end here. I know it was a bit fast, but and I was being greedy. All of us were being greedy. We wanted to share everything about the work that we have done. So we wanted to give a snapshot at least. Thank you very much for listening, and look forward to the discussions ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pallavi. Thank you so much, Pallavi. Thank you so much, Sunil, for briefly introducing our report. Yeah, we wanted to share so much, but so I think it has been very well emphasized by our speakers that health regulation is dynamic and evolving determinant of a strong health system, which requires continuous engagement and balancing of interest for all the stakeholders. And they are a necessary condition to facilitate access to care, protect the interest of the patients, and to discourage irrational practices that lead to their overuse or cost escalation, which we have especially seen in the pandemic. Yet they remain one of the very less understood aspects in our country. I now welcome, with this background, Professor Deepika Jain. She's Professor of Law, Vice Dean Research, Vice Dean Clinical Legal Education, and Director of the Center for Justice, Law and Society at Jindal Global Law School, Sonipat. She has been working in the areas of law and marginalization, gender and sexuality, public health law, critical legal theory, among various others. Professor Deepika has been involved in crafting policy interventions and advocacy with the parliamentarians, legislative and judicial interventions, and her work has also been cited by the Supreme Court of India. I request Professor Dr. Deepika Jain to please share her views on the study and suggest ways of taking this work on regulation forward.
Thank you, Sonali, and thank you, friends at HSTP, for having me on this panel. It is my honor to be here. I would like to start by congratulating the authors of the report, Sunil, Pallavi, and Sonali, for a much needed, timely, and an important report on health regulations in India, which fills the literature gap that existed for a very long time. Now, according to the government data in 2015, 63 million Indians are pushed into poverty by health expenses each year, mostly occurring in rural areas as outpatient care. In 2002, a study showed that 40% of Dalit women in Karnataka are less likely to have antenatal care than upper caste women. In 2006, a study found that children and elderly mortality is the highest amongst Adivasi communities. In 2019, another study by an author, Sobin, suggested that the caste is a major barrier in interaction between public health service providers and patients. During the pandemic, we have seen several stories of our failing healthcare system and the extreme deprivation of the marginalized societies and people. Now, this begs two questions, which are really important and related to the report. One, is the healthcare system equitable? Are the existing health services responsive to class, caste, indigeneity, regionality, and gender hierarchies? And I think when you read this report, you continuously ask yourself this question, because the report has managed to highlight some of these very important concerns that deserve the attention of our policymakers and lawmakers. The report highlights the complex and tangled web of healthcare regulations in India, and I'm going to look at 3 important findings, which I think require a very nuanced, rights-based understanding of regulation. The first one is lack of workers' rights. The study mentions that nurses face issues, and I quote, related to the working conditions, pay scales, non-payment of salaries, confiscating the degrees, and various forms of exploitation of nurses in private health facilities, unquote. The private sector is particularly cited as exploitative towards nurses due to low salaries and poor negotiation between the management and the nurses. We know that in the pandemic, the ASHA workers and sanitization workers have faced a lot of issues because of lack of regulations and non-recognition of their labor within the health spectrum. Number 2 is the report highlights the issue of patient rights violation, which is really, really central to understanding how access to healthcare works in our country. The report highlights that CEA does not articulate patient rights, and the grievance redressal mechanism is therefore of limited scope for patients whose rights are violated both by allopathic doctors and practitioners of alternative medicines. Now, we see a legislation like the HIV/AIDS legislation that provides for ombudsman, but the report highlights that even though the law provides for ombudsman, there are no ombudsmen in these hospitals, so there's lack of implementation. And thirdly, the report highlights the issue of privatization exploits. Now, what is really interesting is that I really found this study really interesting, which is about the cases that went before the Consumer Dispute Redressal Commission in Delhi from 2009 to 2014. And it says that 43 cases out of 48 were against private actors for medical negligence. So this is telling us a story of the private players in our country. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, instances from various states were reported where costs of private ambulances were increased and the cost of inpatient care was as close as 1.5 lakh rupees a day. So moving forward, I want to look at 2 aspects in terms of critical engagement. I think it's important for us to ask this question when we talk about regulation, how must the regulation operate? And I want to spend some time on that. And I'm going to take 2 instances from the report to sort of contextualize the idea of how does one regulate, what is the purpose of regulation? And as we know, health is an extremely complex subject and the regulation is bound to be complex. So do we need a more nuanced indigenous approach to regulation? And how do we achieve that? I think those are the fundamental questions that are raised by the report and which I thought were very interesting and deserves attention. Now, India's current level of public financing of health in India is one of the lowest in the world. We know that, and it does not even cover basic facilities for all. This has meant that most health expenditure in the country is out of pocket, borne by patients themselves, leading to distressed financing. Now, the agenda of privatization of healthcare, spearheaded by the central government, aims to turn hospitals into industries and the state into a strategic purchase of healthcare as a consumer good. The central government has preferred to incentivize private players instead of setting up and building infrastructure that is sorely lacking. India's healthcare system is inadequate in terms of medical facilities and presence of adequate number of qualified healthcare professionals. According to the National Health Profile of 2017, India has only 1 doctor roughly against 10,200 people in public sector. A recent study that I was part of as a part of my center, we conducted a study where we saw in the context of abortion, we saw that there was 80% shortage of abortion care providers in the community health centers across the country. In places like Arunachal, Meghalaya, Mizoram, there was a 100% shortfall of pediatricians. And when you look at these data in the context of nurses, it's even dire. So one of the data that I looked up about from 3 years back, it says that the ratio is 1:670, whereas the WHO norm is 1:30. Now, in this backdrop, it is really important to understand that regulations have to be looked at in the indigenous context and not how developing countries have done their regulations, because I think the indigenous context brings out a lot of nuances and complexities which may not be solved by a black and white legislation around health rights. So allow me to take an example on this. So one of the concerns that the report highlights is around regulations of pharmacies, and it says that basically what it says is that there is irrationality of irrational drug regulation. Now, I wanted to sort of spend some time on this example by narrating a story to you. Let me narrate a story which underscores the importance of a nuanced, intersectional, anti-casteral, indigenous regulation that is required in the current context. So I am right now currently living in a small village called Anej in Himachal Pradesh, and the closest healthcare facility is about 3.5 kilometers. Another valley, Spiti Valley in Himachal, does not have any healthcare facilities. So if a pregnant person needs ultrasound, they have to travel for 4 hours to Himachal. Now in this context, what we have in Anej is a small pharmacy which caters to healthcare needs of people very efficiently. So I have a 5-year-old, and whenever he falls ill, I just go and consult a pharmacy. There is no way that I'm going to Shimla or Solan to consult someone. There was another study that was done in 2015 by an author called Basak, and he looked at the importance of pharmacies in the rural context, where they're in the backdrop of having very few doctors and professionals. And he interviewed a lot of people to see whether pharmacies were helpful in that context. And I'd like to share one of the interviews, which was really telling. And I quote, and he says, "My working place is outskirts of Tamil Nadu in a rural area, but has university teaching hospital that provides improved healthcare facilities. Many private community pharmacies around the campus cater to the needs of medicine to many students and residents of remote nearby areas. One neighborhood community pharmacist provides medicine as remedies for both trivial and common ailment to students and local residents. He sells prescription medicines without prescription or also against old prescriptions. He recommends medicines for various illnesses. He provides first aid. He sells medicines with low markup and provides all other services without additional fees. He makes available all the medicine needed in the area at an affordable price. People depend heavily on him because of the strong faith they have with him." Now, rural areas lack doctors due to remoteness. We've established that, which makes it really hard for people living in those areas to travel to well-equipped medical facilities. So under such conditions, it is really important to ask whether pharmacies can address inequitable access. And when we're looking at regulating pharmacies, is that an important question that we should be asking? The other thing that I want to look at is the over-regulation of pharmacies, something that I have explored in my own work. So as highlighted by Pallavi, one of the problems of over-regulation in India is that, and conflicting regulations, is that institutions and individuals need to turn to multiple competing authorities for guidance and can compromise access to healthcare services, which are otherwise allowed by the law. Now, let me give you an example of abortion. In India, medical abortion is legal up to 7 weeks, according to the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act. Now, a pregnant person, however, requires the doctor's prescription to be able to get the MA pill, which are not available over the counter because they're not a part of the Scheduled H drugs. So even though MA pills are clearly permitted by the law to be dispensed at chemist shops pursuant to a valid prescription, recent studies by Pratigya campaign has shown that various states, including Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Rajasthan, Haryana, Punjab, and New Delhi, have shown major shortages in stocking of these pills. In an interview conducted by Pratigya campaign again, they found, in an interview conducted with pharmacists and chemists, they found that 56% of the chemists cited the reason of overregulation as one of the reasons for not keeping these drugs. The study also pointed out that 43 to 50% of clients purchase pills with prescription, which is contrary to the common perception that MA pills are purchased over the counter without prescription. So basically what happens is there is a huge amount of harassment, which is also something that Pallavi highlights in her presentation, from both inspectors under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act and the Pharmacies Act, which means that the MA pills, although allowed by the law, are not available. So the over-regulation has had a disproportionate impact here, which has resulted in inaccessibility of abortion pills. Finally, I want to look at, in a related context, I wanted to look at when drafting regulations, whether criminal law should have a role in these regulations, whether criminal law should have any role in healthcare. So for example, the PCPNDT Act of 1994 regulates diagnostic techniques used during pregnancy, which determines the gender of the fetus, and it has nothing to do with abortion. The broader objective behind this law is to ban prenatal sex and gender determination. Now, there is another law, which is the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act 1971, that regulates abortion and allows for abortion under certain conditions. Now, yet the conflation of these legislations on the ground is quite telling in terms of abortion. So there are a lot of doctors who will not, I mean, there's a lot of evidence and studies which point to the fact that there are a lot of doctors who would not give services, third trimester abortion services due to prosecution under the PCPNDT Act. Now, which has created an anti-abortion rhetoric in the country. So while regulations are important, what kind of regulations are suitable is an important question that one needs to be mindful of. Finally, I want to look at a very small example, and Pallavi did mention that they will be looking at home-based care in a more elaborate way, which is a really interesting part of the study, something that I had very little familiarity with. Now the report traces the evolution of home-based care, especially in the context from a shift of joint families to smaller family units, where the burden of care used to traditionally be relegated to women. Now, the report mentions home deliveries by community health workers like ASHAs and ANMs. The study says that with very limited regulation, there are concerns about the quality of service providers and services, especially with increasing demand for home-based care. Now, in arguing for regulatory framework on home-based care, the examples are primarily of Western countries, USA, Germany, Netherlands, Scotland, and Sweden. Societies with highly individualized notion of care as opposed to community-based care approach that are more prevalent in Asian context and especially Indian context, especially looking at communities like Adivasi communities. So this begs the question back again, why, when we are regulating, what should we cater to and what should we be mindful of? Now, law doesn't solve all the problems. We keep saying that all the time to everyone as lawyers. It doesn't solve all the problems, but we need the law. We need regulations because A, law can limit the coercive power of the state. It can ensure equitable access to healthcare. And finally, it ensures accountability on the part of the government, where it is the responsibility of the government to protect and promote public health. So with that, I just wanted to thank you for this wonderful report. I learned a lot. It's really comprehensive. And I look forward to your further work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deepika. That was, you brought in a very important dimension, which I think is something that has little emphasis, which is the over-regulation, the component of over-regulation. I know the Lawrence Gostin's caution about restraint on government is something that I think it's been kind of missed out, and thank you for highlighting that. And also and I'd also like to thank Professor Baru for looking at placing regulation not as a standalone building block, but as part of a larger, the systemic relationship and the politics and the power, the political economy of the environment in which regulation arises and operates. Now, one of the topics that has been highlighted and I think not responded to is the emphasis that is placed on the role of professional associations, and I think this has to be responded to. Hopefully, one of the doctors sitting here can kind of respond to it. Dr. Krishna Reddy, I see you among the panelists as a practicing cardiologist who also is active in the NGO space. Would you like to respond to some of the comments that were made on this? If I may invite you.
Yeah, thanks, Rajiv. Just logging into as a panelist. I mean, from my perspective, and 2-3 things are there. One is, while there is a governance-led regulation, government-led regulation, or the legal regulation, in a complex systems, I mean, what ultimately works and is time-tested is the so-called self-regulation and the market regulation. We are a democratic society, and we looking at For example, if I look at the quality regulation, whatever is the incentive structure of NABH, giving incentive, the financial lever to adopt the quality regulation. But when there is a competition for the same customer, the patient, the hospitals compete with each other. So that competition, that is what is the market regulation, enhances the quality of services. I mean, so this is what I call the market regulation as well as self-regulation. While there has to be a legal framework, but in terms of its practicality, in the cultural background of the country in which the regulation is used as a tool for corruption, regulation is used as a tool for harassment. If that is the context and the culture in which we have, we need to look at the alternate regulatory systems of a complex system like a health system. I give an example of how two regulations contradict each other. For example, the PMJ or the drug price regulation. On one side, we say price regulation of stent is 30,000 as a maximum price regulation. But there's no regulation on the clinical service price. So the net result was that while the stent cost has come down, the angioplasty service charges have commensurately increased. So the net cost to the patient hasn't changed. So the two departments within the same regulatory system cannot work together to make it impactful and effective. The second example I will say, from a disposable, single-use disposable context, you are not supposed to use an item which is single-use. For example, we use a beating heart stabilizer, myocardial stabilizer, which itself costs about 80,000 rupees per piece. The bypass surgery, the benefit package by Aarogyasri for the last 15 years is 1 lakh. And 90% of heart surgeries we do with the beating heart surgeries. Okay. So on one side, you are designing a benefit package which forces us as a clinicians and the cardiac surgeons to reuse this myocardial stabilizer, which is not supposed to be reused. So this is the disjointedness. I think Professor Baru has highlighted how the regulation has to be through a systems approach rather than regulation in silos. Because regulation in silos will not bring out the unintended consequences on other aspects of health systems. So I'm happy to hear, I think, such a complex subject of regulation. One more thing which I was coming across the Duke research study report, which I think the Maulik has mentioned in his chat, the cost of regulation. Because nowadays, I mean, we want the health system to be as efficient as possible, as cost-effective as possible, as value care services as possible. But when you look at the US system, the cost of regulation can actually insure 3 times the uninsured Americans every year. So we need to be, I think, conscious about the cost of regulation equally, because just like we are trying to do the prioritization of what services we will give through a public healthcare systems or what services we want to cover in terms of the priority settings. We also should be conscious of what is the cost of regulation? What is the incremental cost of regulation, say, of a quality? So these are, I think, some more dimensions of regulation I wanted to bring out. Thanks for the opportunity, Rajiv.
Thank you. Thank you. Kate, you had mentioned this issue about how regulations are making it difficult for people to enter the health, human resources or health. Would you like to expand on that? Kate.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yeah, we can, yes.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so hello, I'm Dr. Kate Telenko, and I'm a health workforce specialist. And I've seen a trend around the world that we're calling credential creep. It's the fact that more and more health professions are raising the minimal degree and minimal number of years to enter that profession. For example, in many countries now, to be an audiologist, you have to have a PhD, or to be an optometrist, you now have to have a PhD. And all the evidence shows that when you increase the length of years of training and increase the degree, it doesn't improve the quality very much, but it greatly increases the cost of education. It increases the number of years of deferred income, and it increases the likelihood that the graduates will work in metropolitan areas rather than rural areas. And actually the head of the American Association of Medical Schools says that they've seen, when costs increase, they've seen that minorities, people from medically underserved communities just stop applying to these degree programs. And so, this is it's a regulation that's intended to improve quality, but in the end, it just decreases access greatly.
I think when at the time when India was framing its health policy, we made that mistake of opting for the qualified medical practitioner, and I think our country has been paying for that for a long time since then. But what's also happened when we look at how you prepare for the next pandemic, one of the things that many of us consider is how do you approve people with less than the fully qualified professional degree to come in and augment the workforce of an even worse pandemic of the future. So this question of how HRH human resources can actually be made appropriate to the economic and social situation of the country, and also to a health emergency is I think something that many of us will be talking in the years to come. Thank you, Kate. Maulik, would you like to take us through what you anticipate would be the cost of the regulation that you flagged in your chat?
Got disconnected. Sorry, I got disconnected.
Yeah, you're on.
For me, Raju, I think so. This is. Thank you for posing that question. For me, it's a big area of concern, and I have two dimensions, right? One, as Dr. Reddy rightly mentioned, the humongous cost input, right? But when we go with again, Professor Baru's comment at a health system level, right? Any life saved is a better investment than a life lost by input value, right? And at the moment, with our experience, we were working with another partner. We were trying to assess what is the real cost of regulating maternal and child health services. And unfortunately, we could not complete that piece of work because the attributable cost, right, is difficult to measure. But I think so, we need to develop measurement indicators or frameworks which can really measure the regulatory effect, cost of regulation, both at a systemic level and at a healthcare service delivery level. And I don't think so that system or that science has evolved much. Thank you.
Thank you. And which the other problem that we encounter when we do the costing of any health issue in India is the data on cost is very, very difficult to come by. And I think regulation will be even more complicated than that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We have Ms. Sujata Rao on the call. Madam, Sunil has kind of said that the health secretaries at Government of India, Government of state governments have not performed as he would have expected us to. Now, as chairing the session, I don't want to abuse my position, but would you like to respond to that?
It was nice to be listening to the conversation. I didn't expect to be called out. So I don't know how to quit. And I'm a bit of a tube light in life. So I respond rather slowly. I'm not very quick. But what I would say is that, I recall the year 2010 when we were trying to get the Clinical Establishment Act through. And I know personally how difficult I found it to negotiate the political system. Even though you all have gone through the Clinical Establishment Act and you have seen how toothless and stupid it is. I mean, there was no meat in it, really speaking. But even the little bit of regulation, all it did was to ask people to register themselves, get a registered number, so that that's even for cinema halls, we have it. It's a very routine. It ought to have been accepted so easily. But even that little toothless enabling factor, it took so much of, I know how many discussions I had to convince Ghulam Nabi Azad, how I had to approach the Vice President's office to get it to put on the, for passage of the bill, and the amount of sabotaging even for the little bit. So and Ghulam Nabi Azad, to be very fair to him, was not against the act. He said, what is there in this act? Where is the cost control? Where is the accountability of patient care in this? Because he firmly believed, and I think he still believes, that all private sector is crooks. And they say that, if you go with a stomachache, they'll take away the kidney. I mean, he has that firm view of unethical practices of the private sector. And he wanted that to be nailed into this act. But we tried to convince him that even this, without those very contentious issues, itself is getting so difficult to be passed. How do you think if you put cost and accountability, there's no question it won't even get tabled in the Lok Sabha, leave alone get passed. So, that is the strength of the doctors' lobby and the IMA. And Andhra Pradesh brought this Clinical Establishment Act in 2000. And when I was health secretary in Andhra, we did the rules. For 2-3 years, it was in the dustbin. Did the rules, but even till to date, it is not implemented. So the bureaucracy can do anything, It's not lack of ideas or understanding that regulation should be pushed. But it is just that the political environment within which they have to work with doctor lobbies who have so much of power over that's why I've been arguing with my medical colleagues that you must accept regulation, and not just be so against it. But that I think is improving since then. I do hear a lot of private doctors and eminent doctors saying we ought to be regulated, we want to be regulated, and so on and so forth. But I think that some advocacy needs to be done, and the political system needs to really push through. There's a lot, Rajiv, as you know, one can say, the MCI bill and so on, but on this Clinical Establishment Act, I think what Sunil had said, that's a real problem there. MCI is another thing. I mean, the whole story is worth writing a book about. How it was stonewalled at every step. If you really see what a tragedy from 2000 to 2010, when that Ketan Desai was thrown out and we brought a regulatory body because he had a CBI case. I mean, that really goes to the credit of the government, which this government didn't have the guts. When a parliamentary standing committee gave such an indicting report on the MCI, I remember going to the PMO and saying, you can't find a stronger abuse of the MCI than the parliamentary, all political parties, MPs are there. Please get rid of this MCI. Even then, the political will was not ready to set it aside and bring in a board. So it's very, very, very difficult. And, Mr. Modi is not a weak PM. He's quite a strong PM. He had a huge majority. He could have done it. The whole thing of what Rama had mentioned in her talk was the political economy factors. You have to read regulations from that angle to understand the whys and hows and all that. No point saying bureaucrats are no good, or, they're lazy, or they don't want to do, or they're stupid. Forget about it. That's just, finding some fig leaves here and there to justify non-performance. It is a political, I always believed health is political. intensely political. And they're very, very strong vested interests. Look at the Drug Regulation Act, how it's still in the back burner. Medical Devices Act. I mean, you can name it. The number of man hours that have gone into trying and pushing that. It's very tough. So we have to wait for good days to come. And people like Rajiv and all sitting with HSTP as a platform, we should really do this advocacy, because I strongly believe, Rajiv, it's not the bureaucracy that can bring in regulation. It is only the doctors, they themselves have to start demanding a regulatory framework for more ethical practice. It's only then it will come. And I do believe that there will be people in that sector who will be for it, you know. Otherwise, if they are against it, there's no way you can get through. Sorry, I hope I didn't.
Yeah, no, you haven't, ma'am. Thank you very much. I think you brought a very interesting point. My only comment on that is political process is something that we have to get engaged with, and professional bodies are not the only ones who play. Let me give an example of what happened when we were pushing our Clinical Establishment Act. Incidentally, the Central Act has a cost component in the sense that it says that the government will fix the cost, which I did not agree with. And in the Kerala Act, we have put saying that government will not fix the rate.
That came in the rules, if you see.
Yeah. No, but what the story I was about to say was that your minister, Gulab Ravi Azad, called me up and said, well, you are sold out to the private sector. No, when he said that. Now, I was actually talking about something else, which was, you know, when the act was before the, when our act was before the Assembly Standing Committee, some of the MLAs called up and said, look, there's a lot of lobbying going on and you have to counter it using the same weapon. So they suggested that why don't you arrange for public hearing? So we arranged for 3 public hearings in which we invited civil society people to come in. The voice of the civil society was so strong that the people who are opposing it, the laboratories, hospitals, just piped down. So the only way to counter politics is to bring in the counter argument also. And
I fully agree. I fully agree.
That brings us to another interesting question that's been raised. That is the point made by Ms. Rajna Parekh and about the Mental Health Act. To some extent, that also applies to the HIV Act. Now, what is the extent to which the provisions, which these are the only 2 acts which recognize, a right to health. I mean, there's a wrong perception that India has a right to health, which it does not have. I mean, courts have extended the right to life in Section 20, Article 21 to include. That's a very, very stretchy kind of thing. But these 2 acts explicitly recognize the right to health. And the point made by Ms. Rajna Parekh is, what's the extent to which this is actually being implemented? Would you like to expand on this, madam? Or would anyone like to comment on that? That is a very important point. Having something on the act is different, but having it on the ground is something else. So would you like to expand on this comment of yours?
I think she's having some trouble accepting.
Okay. Can she speak without her video on? Yeah, she's on. Yeah, please.
Yeah, she's here.
I am. I'm trying to speak, but I think you cannot hear me.
No, we can hear you. We can hear you.
We can hear you. Thank you. Sorry, I thought that I did not really have those rights to speak. The audio rights. So thank you, sir, for bringing this up. And my main point is that I think the act is audacious in a way to mention mental health care as a right. When we know that the system is really failing to even provide essential and those care in those areas that have been prioritized for so long in our country. I really welcome that. However, what I fail to see is that while it is heartening to see it articulated like this, I really don't see how otherwise are the systems in place to make sure that this translates into some form of perceptible reality. We are struggling with how the state mental health authorities are being formed. We really don't have a dashboard to even say how many states have those kind of authorities. And I know that the recently available data is only through an RTI, which goes back a few months, and one of my colleagues had filed it. So I'm struggling to see that while we can articulate a certain healthcare, certain aspect of healthcare as a right, do we really have those systems in place to make it into a reality? And I'd really like to hear panelists comment as well as eminent guests on the list, on the attendee list, to kindly comment on this and to share their insights with how professionals like me can bring this forward. Thank you.
If any of the panelists would, if any of the attendees or panelists would like to comment, please, you may raise your hand and we can invite you to speak. I think this is a very important issue. It also ties to some other areas that have been raised in this discussion. So if anyone would like to respond, that will be good. Okay, while we wait for others to respond, let me respond, Dr. Parikh, on my experience with the Mental Health Act. Now, the Mental Health Act is a very, I would say, almost a utopian act in a country where mental health facilities are very limited. And the point made by by Kate, that is, in asking for the best, are we becoming the enemy of the good? Now, if you look at the provisions of the Mental Health Act, I don't think any state in India would have made them available. So, so when you ask, has it been ensured? The counter question would be, are we equipped to ensure that access to mental health is made available? What is the level of availability of mental health services in the country? I come from a state which is one of the best, which has got psychiatrists at the subdivision hospital level, but even there, one struggles to provide the level of the quality of services that is there in the Mental Health Act. So your question is valid. It's there in the Act. Is it being provided? The answer, I think, as of now, is no.
If I can just contribute, my only worry is that, it was difficult to even label something as a right. Now that we have done it, if we don't have a mechanism to ensure even a resemblance to it in the real world setting, it is going to be easy to label anything as a right and then get away with it. And mental health is on such fringe in any case. I've been working in this area for some years now, but we all know it's on such a fringe. It's really on the fringes of healthcare system with whatever budgets are available, and the story is well. I really worry that this has impacts on how other healthcare areas will also be seen in future. And if we label something as a right, we are ourselves accountable to make sure that it is given as a right, it is made available as a right. So
Sujata Rao would like to respond. Ma'am, please come in.
All I would like to say is, I think, it is a very forward and a progressive step to get health declared as a right. There is no doubt about it. It's a good thing. But at the same time, its enforcement does require a commitment and a real commitment to resources. Just look at the right to education. What is the point? You have a right to education, and if really every child in the country stood in a line saying that I have a right to education, I want to be admitted, there's no way the schools are adequate enough to admit them, or the teachers are adequate enough to admit them, and the budget of education to revenue expenditure hasn't really significantly increased. It's still hovering around 3%. So unless and until, and that's the only reason why, though there was this right to health bill hanging in the ministry since 2008, it has still not been taken up seriously, is only because of this fear that if indeed we brought in as a right, if Joe goes to a nursing home, a private nursing home, and gets a botched up surgery, he will end up in the court asking for compensation, and it's always the government that ends up paying or doing something about it. That's the only fear that the government has, that the accountability of government increases manifold, which is not a bad thing, but at the same time, it requires a lot of resources to enforce that right. That's the only comment I have.
Pallavi, I say your hand up. Do you want to respond?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just to this, Rachna, I know where you're coming from and what is the point of having it in the act. I know you don't mean it that way, but you're saying how it impacts other acts in future. At the same time, I think it is also important that we are optimistic about it. I know it is difficult. It will not get there anywhere anytime soon. Like Sujata Rao ma'am said, that's why the right to health has never not been passed, because of the fear that what if it passes, then how will we deal with it? We don't have the resources. But one demand of the civil society has also been that once it is passed, it is a right, at least we have something to negotiate, to ask for, to move ahead on. It will be difficult again to implement, to get it, but at least there is something which has come out that we can further work upon. So I would rather want to live in this happy world where I think that there is this opportunity which we can capitalize on, which we can use at some point. It is, our onus is a lot on us, in a way, people who are working in the sector. The government probably has done its part in bringing it in as a law. Now, how do we get it implemented? But I think it is important for it to be just there. Even that is important and then the next steps need to be taken, of course. It's not sufficient, but important. Thanks.
Thank you. Deepika?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond by saying that I agree with both Sujata and Pallavi. So I think one of the things that constantly comes up with laws in the country is that what is the point of having this, because it's not working. But I think it's really important to understand the political and moral symbolism around law, which holds the government accountable. And I think that in itself is very beneficial, but law cannot solve issues. So if there is going to be, for example, a lot of Adivasi women are not able to access to abortion services, say in the state of Chhattisgarh, there is also landmark High Court case there. Now, the problem is that it is also to do with the discrimination that happens around caste, class, indigeneity, etc. So the law will ensure that that discrimination is penned down as a rights-based framework where you cannot discriminate. And I think that's really important. But I think the problem is also how these laws don't actually penetrate through the social fabric, in the sense that, for example, abortion law, I mean, so many doctors are so afraid to provide abortion services, though it's been legal for 40 years, because there's so much confusion on the ground amongst doctors on what law works, how it doesn't work. So I think there is also a holistic, multi-pronged approach that is required in training people, in understanding how these laws operate and how there are conflicting laws, how do we settle that? But I think rights in itself are very, very important and very fundamental. And although they may not immediately be gratifying, in the long run, they will sort of be very important in terms of accountability. And just like the Constitution is an elite document. It may not work for everyone, but it's really important because it gives you the peace of mind that it's there and you're protected. And I think that's really, really important. So having a right is non-negotiable, but I think there are many, many things that need to be done. So it's just the first step. And after that, and of course, the political economy part is at the heart of it. There is just no budget, no money. Even after the pandemic crisis, 2 years now, they haven't increased any money. So we have the most, amongst the BRIC countries, we have the lowest healthcare infrastructure and budget. So how are we going to, I think those are questions of resistance. Like, I think that also came up in the panel, like, we have the rights, we don't have budget, what do we do about it? We make noise about it, right, as a civil society. So I think we have to think beyond that question. Rather than question the idea of law, we have to also think about how to implement it, and then what kind of strategies are required, and political will is very important.
Rema?
No, it's a very, very important and an interesting conversation. And I think one of the things that occurs to me is that when even the Mental Health Act, which we are talking about, and I think Rachna raised a very important point, that at one level, psychiatry is at the periphery in terms of its priorities in the health service system. But also that the civil society has been very, very active in pushing for regulations, in crafting laws that are very progressive. But I think the misfit is that what is the profession of psychiatry itself debating about the need for such a legal provision? I'm not expecting an answer on this, but what little I know in my interaction with the world of psychiatry, they're an extremely conservative world. And I don't know if even in their training, they can look beyond a clinical view of mental health. And this Mental Health Act is like putting the cart before the horse, because the horse here is just not in sync with many of the debates that have informed the Mental Health Act, which, as you know, globally also has been very vibrant. And many groups, feminists and others, have contributed to the whole idea of how do you humanize and, humanize mental health, and how do we treat mental illness? How do we treat people who, and in fact, I have a student who is on this webinar whose work has been on looking at mental hospitals in Calcutta. And so what the Mental Health Act wants, and what is the state of psychiatry and psychiatric institutions and the entire mindset of how mental illness should be treated by the psychiatric community, because they set the discourse in a sense, is an issue we need to think about. I think there is this whole thing of civil society, human rights pushing, and rightly so, an agenda which brings in laws which are very progressive. But the profession itself is not in a position to quite speak to that.
Rema, in defense of my psychiatrist friends, I can vouch that many of the improvements in mental health has happened because of activist psychiatrists. There is a very strong element within psychiatry, who look out at, who are able to look at psychiatry from outside. And I would credit them, this activist group among the psychiatrists, for having pushed the mental health agenda. So let's also acknowledge that.
I know they are, but they are a minority, Rajiv, even within their own profession.
Yeah, they are. That's right. Yeah. Sunil.
Yeah, just 2 minutes I'll take. One is, I understand the rights, and there has been movement by various civil society groups to look at health rights and put it up, and there were some efforts, but the question of whether it is put in the Mental Health Act or is how do you operationalize it at the ground level? That is the challenge. You can have all the rights mentioned, even simple thing like under IPC you're not supposed to get arrested, now you get arrested, and now we have the Supreme Court coming up and passing certain judgments. I mean, so one is, how do you operationalize these rights? I am not so in favor of looking at cost of regulations and what is the impact of regulation in terms of financial, because in our country, we are starting with basics. I mean, for me, the question is, can we get these hospitals and laboratories to register, as Madam Sujata Rao has said? Can we ask them? I mean, I remember working with Rajiv on 2013, it took some 10 years for it to get it, the kind of opposition, even to get basic things done, and getting into cost and all those. I mean, I think we are diverting our limited resources. As it is, very few people are working on this issue. And I think one of the important things is, how do we focus our energies on high priority things in regulation? And one of the major things is to look at legislations and how do we go about it, how do we implement it. Those would be the things. I think there's a lot of said about doctors, psychiatrists, and the regulation, or cardiologists and all. I'm sorry to say that any regulation has to come from outside. History of public health and medicine, especially Western medicine, modern medicine, has showed us clearly that it is not the professionals who will regulate themselves. And whenever they do it, it's not to the interest of the patients and consumers, because there is a certain conflict that is existing. Regulation will come from outside, whether it is from the elected representatives, bureaucrats, or civil society, or whatever. I mean, come on, I don't see that taking place, whether it is in UK, US, wherever. You did have the guild societies and you did have the peer-reviewed, but we know how it happened. And I'm a very strong proponent of using legislation, using technology to do regulation. At least the people have some succor to go through. I mean, when people said, when we were doing the clinical establishment, working on it, what will be the use of this regulation, because it will never get implemented in India. Because in India, we have a lot of legislation, regulation, but they never get implemented. But we said, let us start with at least having a regulation, you know. And now we have a case in the Supreme Court, which has been filed 3 weeks back, which is asking for why is the Clinical Establishment Act in the central government and in the states not being implemented. It has given a voice. I think that is where a start is. And I don't want to get into the clinical, it's a long story. I will stop here. Thanks, Rajiv.
Thank you, sir. I think the consensus that is emerging is that while the immediate implementation of the regulation might be difficult, it's good to keep it there as after all, the writ of mandamus is always there, you know, to be used if and when, you know, when needed. So and you can't have the writ of mandamus unless the regulation is there. So I guess the consensus emerging is that regulation, while it might look not fully implementable at this stage, provides a kind of goal to work towards. Yes, Rima, you had a point?
I think there was an issue that Dr. Krishna Reddy raised, which was, I just want to flag it for us to look at what is the role of a market. What is the thinking of the market for regulation? I mean, and I think going ahead, it would be quite useful to explore that, despite all its problems. And I disagree with Sunil that self-regulation has been a very important partner in market regulation in the United States. And I think we should not underestimate the role of self-regulation of professionals as a lever for some form of reform and regulation.
And also those the Royal Colleges in UK, the extent to which they've been able to standardize practices has been almost entirely internally driven. Yes, Dr. Reddy.
Yeah, I mean, just since I come from the private sector and now I'm donning the role of a public health and health systems area, maybe I'm in a better position to articulate both points of view. Because one, as a sector which is regulated, because I mean, I established the care group of hospitals, 16 hospitals. If I need to set up one hospital, there are 120 approvals that I have to obtain as a part of regulation. And in fact, as a good governance model, we did try to get those approvals. Even when you are perfectly complying with all the quality assurance standards, without even somebody saying that you need to have this NABH approval, you need to wait for 1 year, just to get a fire safety clearance, even when you comply with that, until you bribe them. So that is one aspect of regulation. I mean, the ills of regulation is, are we using regulation? Because see, you want to be regulated when the guys who are regulating you have the moral authority to regulate you. If the governments do not have that moral authority to regulate you, and the governments, the political process itself is corrupted, the citizens do not have the trust in the system which wants to regulate you as a citizen or as an industry or entrepreneur. So that is the area context. I think any complex system, if I look at a human body as a complex system, I have regulation right from at a molecular level, cellular level, at a tissue level, organ level, and then it comes to the frontal brain level. So it does not rest only in the frontal brain when I regulate my entire human body. So like that, any social system, actually, there is a multi-level regulatory process, which we need to recognize and use the levers to actually optimize those regulatory processes so that you don't require the government to regulate you. I mean, this is a strong opinion as a person who experienced the regulation throughout the life. At the same time, being on the public health side, more than the regulation, I look at governance from the point of stewardship. I want the government to be a steward rather than a regulator. The steward is when you understand the both sides. Suppose as a regulator, I pass laws for a private sector separately, for a public sector separately. The quality standards I lay down are different for public sector, are different for private sector. That is not equitable regulation as a government. So in that context, I think the stewardship in terms of understanding. For example, if I'm insurance regulator, if I'm a payer as an NHA, if I don't understand what is the cost of delivering a quality service, what is the cost of capital a private provider actually incurs, if I'm only looking at the direct cost and design my benefit packages and expect the private providers from whom I contract to provide the same quality of service. So there is no understanding. There's no understanding of how actually a service delivery happens. When people comment derogatorily on a private sector as an evil, I think we have to be balanced. We have to balance what is good in the private sector, what is not good in the private sector. Who rose to the occasion of the COVID pandemic? Who manufactured the drugs? Who manufactured the disposables? Who manufactured the vaccines? Who could provide the service that is required when the people required the respiratory care? So any system, the private sector emerges when the public sector fails to meet the needs of the people. It is not an opportunistic growth of a private sector. Because you fail to provide the basic healthcare needs of the people, the informal provider in a village, because you don't have a doctor in the village. Why the RMP is sprouted? Because you fail to provide access to a doctor when you need it. So we have to, I think, conceptualize how the system evolves in response to the dynamic needs of the people. So I think it is not simple and black and white to categorize as evil or good. Yeah, it's a strong response, but I think I needed to respond to some of the comments from Mr. Sunil.
Thank you, Dr. You flagged three very important points. One is the government competent to regulate? That is what you mentioned, the corruption is a prevalent phenomenon there. So does that add to the total cost? That's something that Maulik also mentioned. Two, the government that regulates the providers is also a provider. In fact, the biggest manager of hospitals in a state is a government. So is there a conflict of interest between government as the regulator and government as a provider? In fact, many private corporates sector has argued with me saying, like, you are getting money under our taxes to fund your capital, and you're getting the same money reimbursement under the PMJY for your government hospitals. So is that not unfair? And so that split between government as a provider and government as a steward, as you mentioned, is again something that, thank you for bringing it out. And the third one is that, in fact, I have argued that in Kerala, the private sector came up when government had to withdraw because of fiscal crisis. And the health of Kerala is what it is today because the private hospitals stepped in to make good the gap. I think these are three important points that you made. Thank you very much. Ma'am Sujata Rao, you have a comment.
Yeah, I mean, that was a very provocative set of comments that Dr. Reddy made. And I tried to control myself, but I really couldn't achieve it. You talk private and you have me on. So,
if you control yourself, what's the point of this interaction?
But anyway, I mean, you know me. Well, the point I was just trying to quickly run through my mind is there any country in the world where the state has not intervened as a regulator to control the market, which is the private sector? Particularly when you have a highly commercialized private sector, as we see in India, with all its pitfalls and good points and bad points of what a market player could be. I can't think of any country, because the extreme market-friendly country in the world is America. And there also, they have hundreds of more regulations there than India has. We are the most under-regulated country.
Yes.
Look at America, it is a sea of regulation. I wish I could show you a map I have of the number of regulations that govern the health sector over there, and they enforce it. And America also has its own public hospital. It's not only all private. and they're not as good as your Mass General or something like that. So there is a quality difference between public sector and the private sector there. But their terms of reference of accountability are different. And you know, the reason why this trust deficit continues to plague us is, you know, I'm not sure Dr. Reddy meant it seriously, or if he did, then we have to have a separate session with him. But I think on this COVID, government played a stellar role in standing up to the stresses, despite the several problems they had of human resources, the number of doctors and nurses who have died in the government sector. And the private sector shut its shutters in the first wave. It was in the second wave that it came in. And I can show you, Dr. Reddy, I'm from Hyderabad, that many number of newspaper articles to show how much of the private sector, how exploitative it was, and how much of impoverishment that they've added to the people during COVID time. Jesus Christ, during COVID time, charging 1 lakh and 2 lakhs and 3 lakhs of rupees, even though the government tried to set up some kind of rates, whether it is an ambulance, whether it is the remdesivir, or whether it is black marketing, whether it is a hospital bed, or whether it's an oxygen. So, but that does not take away from the fact that the private sector worked shoulder to shoulder with the public sector in COVID. I'm the first person to come forward and say they played a stellar role, as I think the whole medical community requires to be applauded. So I don't, but then there are always these aspects too. So I personally feel that this debate of public-private trust deficit should go. Private sector must appreciate the constraints under which the public sector works. After all, half of their private sector is surviving because of public sector doctors working in their facilities. So if we really clamp down on the private practice of government doctors, half the private sector hospitals in many of Andhra and Telangana for sure, and Bihar would be shut down. There are hardly any private sector to talk about. So, you know, I think the regulation has to be, it has nothing to do with this argument is constantly thrown at me by the private corporate sector. Who are you to tell me that my hospital isn't doing well? Look at your own hospital. But then Apollo Delhi hardly has 1,000 OP, but AIIMS Delhi has more than 18,000 OP a day. I challenge Apollo or any private sector to take care of 18,000 outpatient a day. I challenge them. You know, so and at the rates and remunerations that a public doctors work in. So it is not a question of comparison. It is a question of trying to do one's best and have a regulatory framework within which both the stakeholders play. And it should be the endeavor of the state government to constantly improve the public facilities and make it equally accountable. I don't at all think that government should be an apologist for the public sector. They have as much a duty to be providing quality service as the private sector has. There's no, that there I agree, but then it requires resources. Back again to the same story. I had to say. I think both of you said almost the same thing. That that the private sector did play an important role. The private sector stepped in to fill the gap. I mean, the government played as in any public health emergency, government played and has to play the major role. What Dr. Reddy said, and rightly so, is that I've seen that across the country, is that the private sector stepped in, and we could not have, as someone who's been involved in Kerala's COVID management, I can assure you that if the private sector had not come in fact, initially the private sector was not welcomed in many states, and they did make good the gap, and I think both of you are agreed on that. And maybe we can have another session on the COVID part later, right? Sunil, we have 6 minutes, yeah, and
2 minutes.
Quick comments, yeah.
I wanted to say many things, but Madam Sujata Rao has said that, and many things I would beg to differ with Dr. Reddy on many of the issues. I think that's a debatable issue. But for me, the most important and the most important in any regulation is the patient-centricness. Any regulation has to be patient-centric. If the patient is lost out, if the consumer is lost out, don't have any regulation. Regulations are not to look at how the provider is and all. It is for patient care. And that I think we somewhere should not miss the point that the patient is the most important. Other things, Dr. Reddy, I would love to come to Delhi and meet you and discuss. We'll take it from there.
Hyderabad.
You can do it. Thank you, Dr. Reddy. I'm sorry. Thanks, Rajiv.
No. I've always found Dr. Reddy to be a person who can, very articulately put forward the arguments on the other side. That's why I kept inviting him, even though he was not ready for it, because he's the right person who can actually answer you, Sunil. And
no, that's the idea of a debate. Thanks.
I agree. Yeah. Dr. Reddy, is it a legacy hand or is it?
No, I think you covered me because when I commented, it does not to undermine the role played by the public sector. It is only to look at both in a rightful way. What is the plus and minuses of each? It may be a good idea to have a session on a private sector engagement as a part of health system strengthening. It's a time actually that there has to be, as everybody agreed, that the trust deficit has to be filled between the two sectors. And we have witnessed how the collaboration between the two sectors, actually, we could face the pandemic to some extent, be it the drug development or the vaccine development or whatever it is. So there is a synergy, and we cannot wish away one sector versus other. The system needs both. So I request for another session, such a similar interesting.
Let's work on it together on this. Thank you. Any burning comments? Any comments that anyone would like to make? Please put up your hand or just unmute yourself and speak. Anybody would like to? We got about 3 minutes before we round off. Well, it looks as if there's no other, anyone who's responding. So thank you very much. For all the enthusiastic participation that was there. Actually, the discussion brought out dimensions that I would say we had missed out in this report. Part of it was not planned. It was more a landscape document, but it's given us very interesting pointers on some of the areas that should be explored in depth. It's also highlighted some of the areas that we could take forward, and we hope to reach out to people who have participated in this session, people who we know. Our survey literature has shown that who are actively working in this area, and what we hope to do is to create a collaborative of individuals and institutions who work in this area. The reason we've been named a platform is that we are almost neutral in the sense that our strength is in bringing people together, and that's what we will try to do in future. And thank you very much for having collaborated. Once again, congratulations to Sunil, Pallavi, and Sonali for this report, which has provoked all this discussion. Thank you, Rama, and to Deepika for the excellent interventions that you made, and to the others who have participated in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Sonali, can we leave now?